Hello, Loving Without Boundaries community. I am delighted to be here yet again with Dr. Amelia Kelley, who is becoming a regular guest here. And we're honored and blessed to have her here. So she's an author and also becoming a colleague and a friend. And I'm so excited about that. So thank you for being here and giving us your valuable time.
You're welcome. And I'm very happy to see you again.
Yeah, lovely. And so I'd love to continue our conversation. We have talked about this a little bit in the past, but there are lots of myths and confusion around the term gaslighting. And I'd love it if you could give the name first off of your two books that you've either co-written or written on your own.
So the first one was What I Wish I Knew, Surviving and Thriving After an Abusive Relationship. And that was the one I co-authored with Kendall Ann Combs, fantastic woman, survivor of domestic violence. And then the newer one, oh, look, it's hard to do the mirror. Whatever direction. We got right here. Actually, I can hold it for you. So Gaslighting Recovery for Women. The complete guide to recognizing manipulation and achieving freedom from emotional abuse. Look at me having to look at the tagline. Sorry about that. sorry, Penguin.
Well, thank you for the work that you've done, because I know how hard it is to write a book, having written mine, which is actually quite short. And so you having co-authored and then you're writing your own book is amazing. So thank you for that work and for being here to talk about it with us. So first, just a lot of people may have an understanding of what gaslighting is, but maybe just starting with a simple definition just to get us started. Sure. And we'll go from there.
So it's a form of emotional abuse or manipulation that is intended to control or distort someone else's sense of self, reality, cause confusion, and almost always for the purpose of attaining, maintaining, or regaining control over someone. And this can happen in any relationship where there's a power dynamic. So it could be familial, it could be, child-parent, romantic relationships, friendships. There's a lot of issues with medical gaslighting, especially for women and especially for women of color. You can see it in the workplace. You can see it on a larger grand scale. We see it in politics, for instance, as we prepare for the next election. Help us all. So it's really something that has been in existence since human power dynamics have existed, but it's really only been in the last century where it was given a creative name based on the play Gaslight. And then really in the last 2 decades where there has been some research, and really just in the last decade where it's become part of more pop psychology. People are starting to talk about it more, probably mainly due to the response of the climate of the world in the last, 5 years or so. So,
yeah, it's definitely, especially with the work that I've been doing for about a decade, it almost seems like it's gaining popularity, so to speak, to talk about it. Like you said, maybe whether it's due to politics or just also maybe people wanting more of an understanding of how to take care of their emotional and our mental health.
Yeah. I mean, what really attracted me to the idea of exploring gaslighting is that at the core of what I love to write about, counsel about, support people with is this idea of empowerment and starting from within and extending that outward. And I have to admit, I was kind of curious how I was going to really approach that. There's so many different ways to address empowerment. It could be self-esteem boosting, self-compassion, which Kristen Neff is like amazing. Look, I cannot figure out the back and forth of it. But, I just was not hitting the nail on the head with what was the way to approach empowerment. And I realized, why don't we look at what is taking away our power? And most commonly, it is gaslighting.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you for having this conversation. And again, all the research and the beautiful work that you're doing. So I'd love to ask, what are some common myths around gaslighting, like what it is and what it's not?
So very important to understand what it's not, because we need to know what we're talking about when we're trying to support our own sense of reality. What gaslighting is not is conflict. Okay. So someone can still be an unpleasant person, a toxic person, and not be a gaslighter. Gaslighting is not when two people confuse a situation. When you see something one way, I see something another way, maybe because our history is different, our filter system about the world is different. It's also not forgetting something, if someone just happens to have a bad memory, or, maybe they have attention deficit issues or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And gaslighting is also not hurting each other's feelings necessarily. Just because someone's hurting your feelings doesn't mean they're gaslighting you. There has to be an effort to deceptively alter your perception of something and to skew your version and skew how you feel. I would say purposefully if it's done by a narcissist, and or for the betterment of keeping control if it's, say, within a system.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. And that answers one of my questions, because sometimes even in my own life, there could be like a misunderstanding, right? Like you said, an example I have is if we have agreements and maybe instead of those agreements being written down, it's a verbal agreement. And
Right.
so our memory might not be perfect, to your point. So I might kind of remember that agreement one way and interpret it one way, and then the other person might remember it and interpret it another way. And if we didn't actually have it written down, or if we had it written down but it wasn't explicitly clear, there could be a difference in interpretation of that, or our understanding of it, or to your point too, our memory of what we had talked about. If it was like a couple months ago, we talked about that, right?
Right. I could see that playing a large role in kind of poly relationships too, when you have more emotions, more people involved, more preferences. If you're not having very explicit conversation, and like you said, maybe even going through a workbook or something where you're asking the questions. Just because you and a partner might disagree with something, though, that's not the gaslighting. It's if you and they made an agreement and then you come to them about it and they outright deny it, or they minimize your feelings about it, or they tell you you're being too sensitive or irrational, or you're just always like this, or you're a bully, just kind of picking at your sense of self to get what they want.
So that would be a form of gaslighting.
That is right. That would be a form of gaslighting.
So minimizing your feel, like, so the ulterior motive of getting what they want by any means, even if it's malicious in a way, and possibly like name calling you and kind of devaluing your feelings, invalidating them, or even name calling in a way, so that your sense of self gets smaller and smaller.
Right. So if you're in a conflict and someone says you're a jerk, that's not gaslighting. But if someone says you are always a jerk, this is who you are, everything, there's got to be some kind of consistency, some story building that goes into this when it is an interpersonal or intimate relationship. You can be blatantly gaslit in the moment, though, especially when you consider things like medical gaslighting, where if you're in a doctor's office and you bring a concern to your doctor and they completely disregard your request for certain tests, and they tell you something like, I don't really think I don't really think your symptoms are connected to something medical. It's all in your head. The "it's all in your head" statement is a form of medical gaslighting.
Because that's also not honoring that person's experience of like their own physical body, for example.
Right. I mean, with the caveat that psychosomatic, so that's when we have symptoms that are connected to our mind, symptoms that come from stress, come from emotions. They can be hard to pinpoint and they can be hard to understand. And if you have a medical provider, with most medical providers do have your best interest at heart. I definitely want to highlight that. But if you have a medical provider who is hungry for sustaining power and they don't have the humility or the humble nature to say they don't know something, and they just can't figure out what is going on with your symptoms, instead of them being vulnerable and saying, I don't know, let me go to the research, they say it's all in your head and they minimize and they won't even do the tests. That's when medical gaslighting can become dangerous, actually.
That's scary when you think about it. So, so I'd love to ask, what would you say are some ways that people can feel more empowered if they do suspect that they're being gaslit, whether it's in a medical situation or in a relationship dynamic, and stand up to that?
So the first is listening to conversations like this or reading the book. Look, I was pointing and now it's next to me. Although that's a good one too, Psychopath Free by
Yeah.
but so the thing of it is that when you encounter something like this, it is meant to be confusing by nature. And so there most likely will be some inner questioning. And so first, learning exactly what it looks like by reading books or by listening to information and podcasts. The next thing, in my opinion, the next best step is absolutely to talk to someone about it. You know, speak to someone else, ask them, did I catch this right? Is this really what happened? Am I reading this wrong? And that could be anyone. It could be a trusted friend, a coworker, a therapist. I mean, really anyone that is going to have your best interest at heart, and maybe hopefully someone who's neutral. Sometimes it's also necessary to collect data. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. Especially I consider things like we were talking about medical gaslighting or at the workplace. It's hard to know how to navigate that. And the person you go speak to may be HR. Right? So it might not be a friend or a colleague because you want it to be someone who has to keep your confidentiality. From there, as much distance as you can create, the better. You know, it's not always a possibility to go radio silent with a gaslighter. Maybe they're, you know, at a job that is just your dream and you don't want to leave it, or they're in your family, or they're your child. You know, it's hard. And so knowing how to create as much space between you and their influence as possible is very important. And finally, you know, the next step really should be happening the whole time. And it's continuing to reconnect with yourself. The more you regain a sense of what you like, what you prefer, what you want and don't want. And this can be done in whatever your most favored form is. So it could be journaling, it could be painting, running, cooking. I mean, whatever it is, if it makes you feel connected to who you are, the more grounded you are within yourself, the more you'll feel the ick feeling when you're gaslit. And that can be really hard if someone perhaps grew up being gaslit and didn't receive modeling that it's okay to put yourself first. And so sometimes it means skipping all the steps I just said, going straight to step 5, leaning into the self-care so that when it happens, you know something is up.
Beautiful. I thank you for giving us those very clear 5 steps and ending with an underscore on, just trusting yourself, listening to yourself, and practicing that self-care. And I think that goes hand in hand too with when you said collecting data. In my mind, I was thinking maybe of like journaling incidents, like this happened on this date and this person said this and I said that. Is that kind of what you mean by
that could certainly be one. I actually have a fact tracking exercise in the book that you can use. But if you do feel, I do write this in there, if you feel unsafe tracking, you're afraid that the person's going to find it, there are, you know, password protected journals that you can use online, for instance.
Well, that's a great tip.
So that's an idea, but also really collecting information. Like I try to impress upon people who are divorcing or have been co-parenting with a high conflict person that they want to make sure to use apps or systems that are created to keep track of communication. Because really emails, that's collecting data right there. But let's put this out there. If you feel like you're having to do this much work to collect data on someone, it is definitely an indicator that there's potentially either gaslighting or emotional abuse of some sort, and probably a good indicator that learning and getting the support you need to get out is important.
That's a great point that, like, for example, if somebody's in a relationship maybe for years and they just get to these places where they're almost starting to feel crazy, right? Because they're like,
Right.
I have to gather all this information so that I can prove that I'm not nuts, like that. Like just
Yeah.
even that alone could be an indicator of, wait, what's going on here?
Can be very anxiety provoking.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
Mm-hmm.
you for that. So let's say somebody is maybe on the other side of it. Maybe they've gotten that person, they've realized what was going on, they have created some distance, or maybe they've removed that person from their life in some way. Can you share a little bit about gaslighting recovery and how that impacts your self-esteem, which might have to be rebuilt?
Right. So the things that I was mentioning a little bit before of reconnecting with what you like and what you want and what you prefer, I don't think people realize how much that gets impacted and how much just knowing your emotions and what they are and when they're happening is such a big part of fortifying yourself after this.
Mhm.
So I talk with a lot of folks about this idea of emotional individuation, where you practice small. You can start small. You can start with disagreeing about liking a particular band. You can tell someone you don't like a certain food. I mean, these sound like such little things, but they can feel really uncomfortable if someone has been primed to be agreeable and primed to people please.
Mhm.
And so those little efforts with people you feel safe with can start to grow a little bit more. I remember a client of mine, she just refused to do this with anyone she knew. She felt very uncomfortable. She was so trained to people please that those poor cashiers that we had her out on doing this, we had a plan where she was going to go out shopping and she was going to try to find something to disagree with the people that worked at the stores about, like just something simple. Like, is it okay if we use paper? No, can I please have plastic? Like something, but let's be honest, folks, let's go the opposite way for the environment. But just like little things. And then extending that out to early boundary setting. The earlier you emotionally individuate in the safe relationships you have and in future relationships, the more likely you will be protected from the very hard to detect initial stages of gaslighting, because the initial stages are not flagrant. They're not in your face. They're like these tiny little, death by 1,000 paper cuts, these
Mhm.
little things that throw you off, these little uncertainties and questioning your memory or questioning what you think, and then brushing it off and going back to the positive, right? And so the more in touch you are with what you do and don't like and what you do and don't want, when you say, no, I don't really prefer that, watch how the person reacts. If they allow you to disagree, and I don't want to say allow, that's a horrible way to put it. If they are respectful when you disagree, then it's a sign it's a less likely relationship that could take this turn.
Mhm.
Mm.
That's a great lens to look at that through. So, and it's another way to almost be collecting data is you stating your preferences, figuring out your own boundaries, voicing them
Mm-hmm.
respectfully, and then watching what happens, watching how the other person responds,
Yes.
and maybe noticing also how you're feeling. Do I feel like I felt respected in that interaction, or am I not feeling safe? I think that's a great lens to be looking at also how you're feeling.
Yeah, there's this group that I meet with once a month called Uncorked Conversations. It's so fun. I wish you lived around here so you could come. Actually, you should come and be like a guest for it and run it.
That would be awesome. I would love that.
Chat about it. And so every month we talk about different mental health topics while
Mhm.
having charcuterie boards and champagne. So
Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing.
yeah. And so one month we were talking about family and boundaries and how do you set boundaries with unhealthy family members. And one of the members had this really neat metaphor that I loved that I think plays into what we're talking about now, which is setting boundaries, which you should be doing all the time, healthy or unhealthy relationships. It's not, boundaries are not just for unhealthy relationships, they are for healthy relationships.
Mhm.
She said it's kind of like poker, where you put your chip out and then you watch and then you look to see, like, what's your reaction? What was your face? What did you pick up what I was putting down? It's kind of like you're watching to see how the other person responds to your boundary.
Mhm.
And that right there is information. But in recovering from gaslighting, it can be very hard sometimes to push past the discomfort of someone not being happy with you if you set that boundary. So this is when it's really the big challenge is to sit in that distress for a little bit and do the things that help you feel more regulated. So maybe that is, I presented some different meditations you can do, some breath work you can do, some yoga that's specifically centered around the heart center and self-compassion. And I think forgiveness, not just for the gaslighter, but for yourself is very important.
Mhm.
Forgiving yourself for maybe not catching certain things and understanding that that's what gaslighting is and that anyone can be a target to it is
Mhm.
really important, because if you're walking around with a self-defeating or a blame mentality, you're really taking the externalized gaslighting and then turning it into internal gaslighting.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. That as you were talking, it reminded me of a book that I really love called Emotional Blackmail by Susan Forward. Have you ever heard of
You'll
that?
have to, I'm like, where's my pen?
Yeah, it's
Please email
amazing.
it to me.
I will. It's an amazing book. It was actually written, I want to say maybe 15 or 20 years ago, but
Hmm.
it's what you're saying right now is reminiscent of that, because the way she describes emotional blackmail is it's when somebody's using fear, obligation, or a sense of guilt to get what they want. And in the book, she talks about how to use non-defensive language and to step into empowerment, remembering like I can stand this discomfort, and I can set a boundary anyway. But she's
Mm,
saying it in her own language. So I thought I would
right.
share that. But also, I don't know if you have a distinction. Like, is there a distinction between emotional blackmail versus gaslighting? I suspect both could be done maliciously, but it sounds to
Mhm.
me like gaslighting is like a very like almost like a higher step above emotional blackmail. I feel like somebody might be using emotional blackmail if they're just feeling a lot of distress and maybe they don't have the emotion regulation tools. They're just kind of unskilled. Like maybe they don't have
Mhm.
a high emotional intelligence, but maybe
Mhm.
it's not completely malicious. That's kind of the way I'm thinking of it. But I'd love to hear
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
thoughts on that. Like, what's the difference between gaslighting versus emotional blackmail?
So can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
Is emotional blackmail steeped in guilt? Is that what I'm hearing you say? Like, does it use guilt as the
The
primary?
the subhead even of the book, I don't have it memorized, but
Why not? I'm just kidding.
it's highlighting, but it's I
Mhm.
remember the 3 things though. It's highlighting using fear.
Okay.
In other words, like, say I make a request of you and, or you I'm sorry, yeah, you make a I remember I ask a question and I'm wanting to hear yes.
Mhm.
And like for my request, and you
Mhm.
say no, and I
Mhm.
flip the F out, you know?
Mm.
So, and
Mhm.
I might be playing on your fear of me lashing out at you, and
Mm.
calling you, verbally abusing you. So
Mhm.
there's that fear, or the second thing is guilt.
Mhm.
So maybe attempting to make you feel guilty for
Mhm.
not saying yes to my request,
Mhm.
or obligation is the third one. So,
Mhm.
we've been friends for a long time, Amelia. Why won't you just say yes and give me what I want? So yeah, fear, guilt, and obligation to get what they want.
So, it actually sounds different than gaslighting to me. And I think that gaslighting probably could be a very effective form of, I almost feel like gaslighting could kick those three things up a notch,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. Because
Mhm.
I think you can instill fear, you can lean into guilt, and you can, what was the third one again?
Obligation, a sense of obligation,
Obligation.
like you owe me something. Yeah.
Right. I think you can lean into those three without using gaslighting, but if you use gaslighting, it will make them even more effective.
Hmm.
It'll make the emotional blackmail more effective. For example, if the fear is, say someone says, oh, you're saying like they are instilling fear in the moment by lashing out.
As an example. Hmm.
Okay. You made me do that.
Mm,
That's the gaslighting.
I see.
You see? So
Yeah.
it's taking the emotional blackmail, and if you kick it up and if you deflect the blame back onto the person, you say it's something that they caused, you say it was a response to their doing, you deny that you're doing it at all. Those are ways I think it can intertwine the two together. But I'm so intrigued because I haven't heard that definition that you said. So now I definitely want to go check out her book.
Yes, it's an amazing book. It's an amazing book. And that aligns with what I was thinking too. Like I kind of feel like maybe emotional blackmail is here, and then
Mhm.
gaslighting is like taking it up like 2 or 3 notches to make it almost more insidious, you know.
Right. Insidious and disarming too. Um,
Mm,
and I think both feed the cycle of abuse quite effectively. But I think one of the things about gaslighting that I find when you get further into the different levels of how intense it can become
mm,
is that codependency becomes really, really prevalent because your sense of reality is so disarmed that you have to look to the abuser for reality.
mhm.
And so that's, in a definition, one of the kind of codependent, you could be giving up your own sense of self for the betterment and the desires of someone else. So I'd be curious taking her stance on emotional blackmail and how that would play into the cycle of abuse and codependency. So yeah, maybe I'll call her and we can collab.
Well, I will tell you, I actually, at one point in my life, this will be interesting because it's kind of related to all of this.
Mhm.
I had somebody in my life who was a longtime friend, and for decades, it was a great friendship. And time changes people. And so we went
Mhm.
through a period of about, literally, I'm not joking, like almost a decade where I really felt like I was getting emotionally used in that friendship, because it doesn't have to be
Wow.
an intimate relationship.
Absolutely.
And she was really coming at it from like a narcissistic view. And I
Mhm.
knew there was other things going on in her life that may have attributed to that, but that didn't excuse the behavior. And so I was doing a lot of research. So I read Emotional Blackmail. I read The Verbally Abusive Relationship. Your book wasn't out
Mhm.
yet.
Mhm.
And I actually worked with Susan Forward, the
Oh,
author of the
cool.
book, for, I don't
Mhm.
know, a number of sessions. And at the time, I want to say she was around 70. So she's
Oh
up there.
no.
I know she's up there. And I haven't like spoken to her in a long time. So, God willing, she's still alive. But she's written a lovely set of books. So I'll happy to drop that in the comments
Yeah.
and tell you more a little bit about it later. But I think you'll find her work very interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, she was ahead of her time.
Exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. Yes, just like Dr. Ruth Westheimer, I got to meet
Mhm.
her in person. That was super fun.
Really?
At a conference, yes, in Atlantic City a number of years ago. So that was a pretty neat experience. But I digress. So I'd love to bring it back to you just in terms of um, maybe a little bit more about your book, and who would you say would benefit by reading your latest book written by you on gaslighting.
So even though it says for women,
Hmm.
I'm just going to throw this out there. I think it's a very helpful book for these particular types of men. First of all, men who have experienced gaslighting, to be honest, because even though I go into the nuances of why women are targeted,
Hmm.
um, all the skills are gender neutral.
Hmm.
Anyone can use these skills. I do think it's helpful for if you are a man who is in a relationship with someone who has been gaslit,
Hmm.
or if you have a family member who has been, it can be really empowering and very helpful, empowering for that person and helpful for you to gain a sense of empathy and compassion for them. I also think, obviously, anyone who's helping these folks should be reading something like this. But first and foremost, I mean, any woman who has been made to feel less than or made to feel like their voice doesn't matter in any form, in any avenue, with anyone. It's a book about gaslighting, but at the forefront, it's a book about empowerment.
I love that. And that really resonates so much with the work that I do too. It's definitely about moving away from feeling disempowered or scarcity mindset and remembering how empowered we are, and also building that up if that needs to be rebuilt, if somebody has felt a little beaten down by that. So I love that framework that you're also looking at that from, which I think is one of the reasons we're such good friends and want to keep having a conversation. So I love that. So thank you for that so much. And when we think about empowerment in your book, do you throughout the book, is there different exercises and ways that you're helping people figure out how to increase their own sense of empowerment?
Yes, I mean, in fact, it's like right here. The book is divided in such a way where the beginning, you're really understanding what gaslighting is about, what it is. You're given examples of it and real life examples, clients that I know, people that I know. Everyone's anonymized, of course. But the second section, like just for instance, the chapter names: Confront Past Traumas, Stand Up for Your Emotions, Break Unhealthy Patterns, and Get Unstuck. So before you even get into the skills for thriving, it's kind of like you have to really confront and unjar yourself from what's happening. And in those chapters, I mean, I go through everything from understanding what it means to have a high score on the ACE scale to what are different forms of abuse, how do you set boundaries. But then in the last part, I work on with them self-esteem, confidence building, self-love. We got a little art therapy, yoga therapy, breath work, mantra work. It's really, I just kind of scrape the top of all my favorite therapies.
Wow.
I think, yeah, there's even a little EMDR in there, not necessarily full-blown EMDR where you're, getting the tappers of the light bar, but a little spiral work. So you're getting a taste of, and my clients, if they take a look at the book, they'll be like, we did that this session. We did that this session.
Amazing. Since you mentioned that, I'm glad that you did. I've been reading a book that is explaining IFS, internal family
Oh,
systems.
love.
Yeah, and I'm only just learning about it. It's a book called Self Therapy, and I forget the tagline, but blah, 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 internal family systems. And a question that I was thinking as you were talking earlier, I'd love to ask here is, now that I'm wrapping my head around it, and you'll explain it much better because you've obviously studied it, and I'm simply just 5 chapters in a book. Can you explain for folks like the general idea of internal family systems in a layman's way?
I'm like giggling and going, well, on page 140, learning your parts.
Oh, that's amazing.
I have a specific IFS exercise and then different things to consider as far as like using parts work in learning about what happened to you.
Okay.
So I love parts work. Richard Schwartz is the one that created this, and it's been continued to be researched. It's really based off, if you look, multiple different psychological theories and even a little smidge of Buddhism. And, there's so many different things that created the basis of IFS. But at its core, it's that we are made of a collection of parts. We are not just one single self that makes every choice. We react different to different scenarios, different people, different experiences, because different parts of us come out. And no part is bad. That's the best part. No part is bad. Every part serves a purpose. Every part deserves respect and to be heard and to be listened to. And really, it's not unless you are trying to just completely obliterate a part or ignore a part. And I'm talking even if you have a substance abuse addiction and you have a substance abusing part, which is called a firefighter. You'll learn a little bit about it in the book. But even that part actually wants to heal you from suffering. Like, they don't want you to suffer, that part. So I explain it to my clients, like if you came into my office and you were just hysterical and you were so upset, and I just said, you're just being too much, they would walk out. I would probably be disbarred or whatever you call it. But there's no way they would allow me to learn more about them. I have to approach them with curiosity and
Mhm.
compassion. The same thing goes for our parts. If we are not curious and compassionate to the parts, even the parts that kind of are flooding us and not really working well with the rest of the system, if we do not give those parts love and respect, we are going to be left out of so much learning. I
Mhm.
think we just pinpointed our next live chat. We should do a whole like little mini workshop on IFS and maybe
That would be
even
great.
get people in a couple little meditations on it, because
That sounds great. Yeah, because
it's so empowering.
yes, I'm 40. So what's funny is in the work that I do with my clients, we at the beginning of our journey, we talk about when they're not their best self and giving that a name, and then talking about when they are their best self or what they're striving to be, to give that superhero kind of higher self a name as well. And that's
Mm,
just kind of a theme in the work that I do. And so once I was reading this book that is describing it, at first I was having a hard time wrapping my head around it. It sounded a little hokey, but the
mhm.
more I was reading it, I thought, wow, this is really just giving like a name to all the different versions of who we are, and then calling forth from an empowering way the best version of us.
Right.
Like, so when I looked at it through that lens, I was like, ah, I got it. This makes a lot of sense to me. So maybe I was almost like touching on IFS work by accident, with the way that I was doing it.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to make sure that I clarify is that, how I said we're not just one unified self, but we do have at the center of all of it, we do have the seed, we do have the self.
Mhm.
And in the book Parts Work by Thomas Holmes, I want to say maybe, it's a really cool book that shows IFS through. It might not be Tom Holmes now. I'm hoping it is, but it's Parts Work. It's all done through illustrations. It's
Oh
really
yeah.
neat.
Hmm.
And he talks about how the center of the self is like the living room that all the selves come in to chat.
Mhm.
And that when we are making choices from the seed of the self, we are connected, we are compassionate, we are at a calmer state. We're not being reactive, we're collaborating.
Mhm.
I think any work, you just added something to this, because any work that you can do where you are finding the self and connecting with the self more, such as meditation,
Mhm.
is probably one of the most important things you can be doing when recovering from gaslighting.
Amazing. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's beautiful, and it validates some of the work and the teaching that I do too, because meditation is a big component of it, and I didn't quite describe it as connecting with that higher self, but yeah, I totally agree with that, because I
Mhm.
often talk about how it's tapping into our intuition, but still our intuition is our higher self. So to bring it back to the gaslighting, what I was thinking of, the book that I'm reading, to give an example, there's and she sometimes husband. So they were giving the name of when she kind of flips out on him when he's working too late and she wants his attention, the temper tantrum part. And then
Okay.
they talked about, then there was the judge that was
Mhm.
judging the temper tantrum part, because then she'd start to kind of beat herself up
Mhm.
for lashing out at her husband. And so I bring this up because of gaslighting, because they talk about blending with the parts.
Right.
So, like, say, let's name her Susan. So, let's say
Mhm.
Susan is blended with her temper tantrum part, and she kind of, flips out on her husband. Um, that I feel like that could actually fall into the emotional blackmail place. But what would be the differentiator with gaslighting, if you think of it in parts work, I guess?
Well, first of all, who's calling her? Who's saying the temper tantrum part? Is that her saying that herself, or that's her husband calling that?
So the book is written from the therapist point of view. So the therapist is working with her,
Uh-huh.
and they were doing the parts work. And I'm just reading this one book. You're obviously an expert at this. I'm not. So, so I know that, but just in reading the book, it's written from the therapist point of view. So he's talking about working with, let's call her Susan, and she's kind of unpacking this pattern that she keeps getting into with her husband, where he's working to serve the family. And sometimes he works late nights, and she was getting upset. And so, and then she would maybe start screaming at him, like, why don't you pay attention to me? Blah, blah, blah. And so they called that part her temper tantrum part. And then the part that was judging the temper tantrum, they called that the judge.
So which part are you curious about if it's gaslighting?
I guess it would be the temper tantrum part.
You're curious if she's gaslighting him or she's being gaslit by the therapist being called.
I guess my question is, like, when in parts work, and again, I'm still learning about it, so forgive me with that. But if somebody's like blended with a part, how could you differentiate that from gaslighting, or was that be something completely different?
Okay, I think they're different because, so what it means when you're blended with a part, if you heard me say before, everyone comes into the living room and the self will talk on behalf of the parts. Like maybe I'm really angry at you about something and I can be just totally in my angry place. My voice will change. I'm not thinking clear. I'm dysregulated, and probably my exiled parts, like my insecurities are coming up. And so my angry part is going to protect my exiles and speak for the system. But I actually don't make much sense, and I'm not really making my point, and I'm probably not going to get the resolution I want. I'm blending with my angry part. Whereas unblending with the angry part would be me going, oh, wait, I'm talking from my angry part. Let me see what my angry part needs right now. Okay, my angry part is feeling insecure because I feel ignored. Okay, what do I actually need right now? So that inner dialogue, that ability to talk to one another, is when you are unblending and becoming more harmonious and balanced, so you can speak on behalf of your self energy. So I don't know I don't know if it would be connected to gaslighting. There might be some gaslighting situation happening that was leading to the temper tantrum. I don't know if I love temper tantrum as a name for a part, but on the other hand, if the client called it that, that's her right to call that her temper tantrum part. I would suspect, as an IFS therapist, her temper tantrum part, that's hard to say, would actually be a child part, an exiled part, maybe something from her past that doesn't get what it needs and that has been kind of ignored. And so she might be reactive because of that.
Yes. And in the book, they do have little illustrations. And so that part is drawn as like a little 5-year-old girl who's like, like having a little temper tantrum. Yeah.
But you know what? If we were going to tie this to gaslighting, since that's what we're here for, if you took someone in the state of blendedness, they are blended with their insecure, they're flooded by their insecure parts. They're blended. They're not speaking intellectually, or they're not using wise mind. If you want to think of DBT, they would be more likely to gaslight someone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at. So you're saying,
oh, cool, we found each other.
Articulating it well, but so you're saying if somebody was blended with their part, then they might be more prone to gaslighting somebody else. Am I understanding that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Especially if their part that they are blended with is insecure, power hungry, fearful, fear of abandonment, narcissistic, all of those things.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. And that was, I wasn't articulating my question well, but yeah, I think we got to it. Yeah.
No, that's okay. I think it was a fun journey.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm still learning about it. So, so yeah, forgive me, but people who are watching and listening to the recording, I'm sure will be learning right along with me if they're not familiar with parts work. So very interesting. Well, beautiful. Well, let's start to wrap it up. And I want to make sure if you could just tell everyone the name of your book again and how they can find it, and also how the two books that you wrote might be complementary to each other.
Okay. So again, we've got Gaslighting Recovery for Women, the complete guide to recognizing manipulation and achieving freedom from emotional abuse. And then The first one was What I Wish I Knew: Surviving and Thriving After an Abusive Relationship. I really, truly believe that they should be sister books. And the reason being is that the first one that I wrote that I co-authored with Kendall Ann Combs, which actually, excitingly enough, later this year, hopefully November, December, it's coming out on Audible. And she and I read it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So she's telling her whole story. And we have a very exciting person doing our intros and outros and all of that. Yes, it was like a serendipitous moment that we got this woman. So very excited about that. But I think that book paints the picture of what are red flags? How do you know what abuse looks like? It goes into everything from how do you get out safely? How do you recover? How do you trust again? And we highlight gaslighting in a section. We highlight narcissism in a section.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that something like Gaslighting Recovery for Women can help people who were specifically gaslit in their abusive relationship take it a step further. So it's kind of like a deeper study in the surviving and thriving portion.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, thank you so, so much for your beautiful work that you've done with both of the books and being here, having these incredible conversations with me. I love talking to you. I always learn a ton, and you're just a pleasure. You're a treasure for all of us. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I look forward to our IFS chat. We're going to have to plan that.
Yes. And I will finish the book that I'm reading and maybe check out that other one as well, so that I'm more well-versed with that when we talk.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.